Thank you.
Well, thank you for her.
Right on.
Yeah.
Hope it goes better than last time.
Yeah, hopefully I can keep it
I
gracefully.
think I'm like 25. My birthday was like last.
Happy birthday.
Birthday's today? No, April.
You're having a good time in the kitchen.
Yeah. I'm a DBT therapist at the Veterans Hospital.
Okay.
Mental health. Yep. Your text always at work.
Yeah, Joe is actually a suicide prevention counselor for the VA.
Yeah, right on. Yeah. I did my internship at Portland DBT.
Oh, cool.
For a year, yeah.
Right on.
Yeah, so
Very
some
good.
of my training there, yeah.
All right, are we back with the streamers? Sit up. Pay attention.
I'm sure she'd kick it over.
Before we move to the last of the four immeasurables, we just wanted to say a little bit about expectations and being honest about them. They are often the source of our struggle in our practice, is our ideas of what we think it should be. And one of the teachings we received that really resonated was this idea of not confusing the path and the fruit. So when we read Dharma books, often there are descriptions about what it's going to look like if we're having perfect shamatha, if we become bodhisattvas, kind of the end state of what it looks like if we become very advanced in our practice. And which, I think there can be value in reading those descriptions, having some sense of what we're aiming at, but it's also really easy to take that and turn it into an expectation for our practice. Like, it's supposed to feel like this. I'm supposed to sit down and be clear, and my mind should be settled, and I should be compassionate all of the time. Like, it turns into this whole list of shoulds. And the reality is, those descriptions are descriptions of the fruit of the practice. Like, we walk the path, we accomplish the path, and it looks like that. But what we're doing right now is walking the path. We're not there yet. And what arises when we're on the path is what arises. It's exactly what we need to work with, what we have to work with. And if it doesn't look like the description in the book of what the end state is supposed to be, that's totally fine. And it's really important that we don't succumb to that confusion and start assessing our practice in terms of, as Jeff sort of jokingly said earlier, I've been doing this a long time. Why aren't I enlightened yet? Why doesn't it look like the description of the 8th Bodhisattva Bhumi that I just read in this technical text? The metaphor that came to mind for me this week when I was thinking about this was the stereotype of the ugly American. Is that an idea people are familiar with? Mm-hmm. So, what is that?
I'd say it's a view of entitlement that other people who in the other parts of the world have, that live a life. They see these ugly Americans who come and steal and take what they want and take advantage of.
Loud. Expectation, yeah. Should go my way. Yeah.
They don't notice other people or that they might be different and doing something important. It's just like, oh, that's good for me, or I want that, grabbing, taking.
The thing I always think of is I had this experience a number of times traveling in India. It's like people make all of this effort to take a trip to go someplace they've never been before, where everything's different, and then they spend the whole time complaining about why it's not like home. I feel like our practice sometimes we can be the ugly American in our practice. Like the whole idea of our practice is to go someplace we've never been before. And then things start to shift and move, and it doesn't look like what we thought it was going to look like. And then we're sort of cranky about it. And that can be a really big obstacle, because perhaps this is going too far, but to my mind, something interesting is always happening in our practice, whether we like it or not. Something is going on. There's always something to see there. So I think the more we can let go of our ideas about how we think things should be, and embrace how they actually are, like recognize the cat's in the room, and that's okay, and let our practice breathe a little and be spacious enough to encompass all of that, the more we're actually opening ourselves to the possibility of transformation, to the possibility of seeing something in a new way, seeing something that we haven't seen before. But as long as we're really wrapped up in the idea of it's got to be like this, good practice looks like this, my practice should be like this, it's sort of putting the blinders on. We're missing what's actually happening, and we're just getting in our own way. So I think really the thing we wanted to say there is, we tend to want to skip ahead and jump to the stage where we're kind and compassionate and steady and unflappable and nothing bothers us, equanimous. And as long as we're on the path, we have to work with who we are, where we are, and that is just the truth of it. And it's okay. It can be okay if we're willing to accept that reality.
I'm going to throw in one comment from the thing that we're skipping.
Yeah.
That's related to this, which is, so we all, to use Sally's ugly American thing, we always want it to be, you go to a foreign country and we don't know why there's no Starbucks there. In the morning I don't have my Starbucks.
Wait, there is Starbucks right there, everywhere.
I always think of India, but it's probably even one in India now. And what we don't notice is that there are all these opportunities we have for practicing when the obstacles arise. Every time we have an obstacle, that very obstacle becomes the opportunity to practice. So the absence of the Starbucks is the moment when we see the grasping for the Starbucks. And there can be a little bit of joy in hunting around for those obstacles as they arise. So long as they're not giant obstacles, it is possible to become overwhelmed by certain things. But it is actually kind of nice sometimes to see an obstacle and recognize the opportunity it presents to do a little bit of practice. And I think throughout this course we've all talked a little bit about that, like we saw something and had a moment of insight of practice, having seen that. So these two things go kind of hand in hand.
It's true, and I remember hearing the teaching early on in our career that anytime you experience a moment of disappointment, that's a sign that you are holding an expectation. You can't be disappointed without an expectation, and so when you feel that, there's an opportunity to look. Okay,
Right.
what was I after there?
Yeah.
What was I holding on to or wishing for?
Yeah. There's even a practice, I don't even remember where I heard of it on a retreat. We got a teaching to watch the craving and aversion. Just that was the activity. It was a caring practice. Just go watch it. and it's like constant. And we filter that stuff out. We're really good, our minds are really good filterers. So once you start paying attention, it's like, wow.
Want, don't want, don't
Yeah,
want.
there's a lot of obstacles here that I'm not usually that aware of.
And it brought you a lot of joy because you had so much to work
In a way, it can be lightning. If you leave it at little things, like just going through your day, and because I work at home, very often I'll walk out and I'll survey the room, and it'll be dirty or cluttered, and I'll have this. And that's one of those moments where
Yeah.
I have this thing going on with the room. Sally probably is surprised to hear that because I never cleaned it up. So.
But you also never asked me to clean it up.
Oh, small things. So you can. So it's kind of a fun little thing to just watch. Ooh, ice cream. Ooh, dirty room. Ice cream, dirty room. There's small obstacles that can be a toehold into the practice.
Yeah, and we should say, I mean, we're speaking about obstacles tonight, and we're talking about merit and humor and unearthing our expectations as though this is an easy thing to do. And with small things, we can find it easy. I also want to not make light of the suffering that we sometimes find in our practice. Sometimes things come up and they totally take us under and completely overwhelm our mindfulness and our capacity to sit with them, and then we're in the reactive state. We're in the reactive frenzy. And that's also something that we have to work with in our practice. And it's something that I struggle with on a semi-regular basis, less now than when I was first on the path. And there's not time to go super deeply into that topic. But I think I've certainly heard from our teachers again and again that when things get hot, it's not necessarily helpful that we have 15 practices to choose from. Like, we need to know what the thing is that we can grab onto that's really a lifeline, and kind of work with that thing when we're not overwhelmed, so that when we are overwhelmed, there's some chance that we'll actually reach for it. And for me, over the years, that has been things like refuge, saying the refuge prayer, or for a long time I just worked with this idea that karma ripens and it creates this wave of thought and emotion, and if it's possible to just sit with it and let it do its thing and not feed it with craving or aversion, that it'll just burn itself out, and then that little bit of karma is done. Like, that was a really powerful idea for me for a long time. Like, okay, all I can do in this moment is let this thing do its thing until it stops. And we do have dozens of tools. There are lots of things we can choose from, but I do think it's really critical to know, like, what is the thing that you can and will reach for that feels helpful to you when you're going under, when you're down. So, all I'll say there.
Just have a kind of a response to that, and I really hear exactly what you're saying, but I found very much so in the last many months that the Vajrasattva practice has been that at those times when it just starts to get off, because it's there and alive and relatively well, I can call up that practice, and it's amazing to me how much it does shift it. It's also amazing to me how much it makes me sometimes just cry and yawn away
Mhm.
while I'm doing the Vajrasattva practice. And it's kind of like something's just, it's clearing things out.
Mhm.
So I think that's an example that you're just saying.
Yeah. Yeah, and we all have things that we really resonate with, and when things are very difficult, what we want is to grab something that really feels potent and alive to us, that holds, genuinely feels from our side like it holds the potential to disrupt the, just the tidal wave.
Equanimity.
Equanimity.
So we're to the final immeasurable, which is kind of different than the others. It's equanimity, which is often translated as impartiality, but I don't really like that so well. I think equanimity is a little bit better. Impartiality gets close to the near enemy of equanimity, which is indifference. So in Buddhism, we often focus on the obstacle being attached to things. And so people who don't know very much about Buddhism think, oh, you just want to be detached. You want to be not connected to anybody. Like, cut them off. Numb. And that's the near enemy for equanimity. The practice itself, I read not in Alan Wallace, but in another location which I failed to note down. The Sanskrit comes for a word that's related to the word I, and so equanimity has this quality of seeing, of just being present with the thing. And equanimity, if we look at the far enemy, actually tells us a lot about what they're getting at. The far enemy for equanimity is craving and aversion. So if we go back, you don't want to be indifferent to craving and aversion. You want to see craving and aversion. You want to, instead of getting caught in the pattern, the spin cycle of grabbing or rejecting, you want to see and equanimity. The English, I think, is a really good English word. Actually, it's one of the rare English words that does justice to the concept. It's the capacity to not engage in that spin cycle. That spin cycle. So when we look back at some of the other immeasurables that we talked about, you go through the different categories of people as you're doing these practices as a way of surfacing to you your own stuff. Your own, your attraction to the people at the start and your aversion to them at the end. Equanimity is that capacity to not be swayed by your craving and aversion. So Buddhas, it's also a final state. Buddhas are fully equanimous. They don't get caught by everything that flies by.
They have no preference.
They have no preference. So rather than constantly having, preference is perfect. Constantly seeing throughout life, we have millions and millions of preferences. And in fact, in some ways, our whole day is guided by ping-ponging through the world of preferences. Equanimity is not a concentration practice of avoidance. It's just being aware of those ping-pongy things and working with them, recognizing that those are preferences. And so this is one of those fruit and path things. It's a little bit hard to avoid thinking of the fruit, which is the final state of not having preference. but working on the practice of just sitting with the craving and aversion that's there. And when you oh yeah, the bodhicitta. That's the other part. Alan Wallace talks about the bodhicitta prayer, and he relates it to equanimity, and it's a really beautiful pulling together of two things that look a little bit different, like they don't relate so much. When we do the bodhicitta prayer before we go into practice, we wish that all beings, that we were practicing for the benefit of all beings. And if you look at that through the lens of preference, you see that actually we have preferences. We would like to do practice for certain beings, and others
Not so much.
maybe not so much. So the practice of equanimity stabilizes all these other things we do, and allows us to actually engage the practices wholeheartedly. So if you go back, equanimity is actually required for you to practice loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and compassion. If you can only approach the practice through the lens of attraction and aversion, you're not actually practicing compassion. You know, you're practicing some kind of sentimentality instead of real compassion. In Buddhism, there's this idea of the two truths, the relative and the absolute. And there's relative and absolute bodhicitta. And the relative bodhicitta is this wishing that we wish that we could benefit all beings. And at a certain point, there's ultimate bodhicitta, which is the non-referential state of compassion for all beings. And that kind of bridge in between those two is equanimity, because that's where we get stuck at. We have the preference. And so at the start, when we're trying our bodhicitta, we definitely have to do it from the point of view of the relative, because that's where we live. But Wallace points out how it's so critical for us to actually actualize those prayers that we're doing. You have a quote here. Would you like to read that, or would you like to add anything else?
I forgot. I wrote a quote down.
Black.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've continued to work with this teaching I found online from Jetson Kundry Rinpoche, so I copied something down here that she wrote. Equanimity begins with not discriminating or being biased toward those you love, get along with easily, or who are agreeable to you. It means not distancing yourself from those you don't get along with, who are different than you, or even worse, have hurt you in some way. As long as there is any discrimination and bias, no good quality can be generated sincerely and absolutely purely. It is very important not to develop discrimination or bias. And sometimes when the four immeasurables are taught, they actually start with equanimity, because it really is seen as the foundation for our capacity to grow these things until they truly are immeasurable, where they apply to all beings without exception.
Could you guys just touch upon that difference again between the relative bodhicitta and the absolute bodhicitta? So they're both love for all beings, but what's the...
Why did I say that?
Ultimate bodhicitta is what arises out of the direct experience of seeing the nature of mind and the nature of samsara. So it is not something that has to be worked on or manufactured. It's the kind of
Okay.
but it's often referred to as non-referential, because the Buddhas had no sense of self and other. It just is what arises in response to seeing the confusion of samsara.
And that therefore it's important to focus our practice on the relative bodhicitta and not ignore that, because this is what I wrote, and that we don't have real bodhicitta unless we have gotten rid of attachment and aversion. So we actually have to work on practicing, trying to develop the relative bodhicitta, right? Rather than, like, in my opinion, I had to, like, I normally just go to the ultimate bodhicitta, like, okay, I have this commitment, yay, I'm so virtuous, like, as opposed to doing, like, the relative stuff, like, thinking about whether we really do have an equanimous approach.
And in the mind training, there are a set of slogans which point at the ultimate, and actually the commentaries usually spend relatively little time there, and those are not the ones that we mostly carry. The other slogans are the relative bodhicitta, and then the teaching that Michael's going to give in a couple of weeks on a Saturday is really addressing that set of aphorisms that deal with the ultimate and how to relate to that. Because you can work with that, and it's important to plant that seed in our minds. It's just we're not going to, and actually we could. Our mind is already the mind of a Buddha. It's possible it could break through at any moment. But for those of us who feel like we're just slogging our way through, we aren't necessarily going to. We don't feel like we're going to spontaneously manifest that insight, but having some relationship to that is still an important feeder to, or nurturing our practice of bodhicitta.
We don't talk a lot about the absolute because it's I'm told, the way that you access it is experientially, not cognitively. And so the cognitive space that we live in is the relative. We live in meat space. We relate to each other in this physical realm. I don't confuse your body with mine. It's very clear where things start and end. The experience of the ultimate is something beyond duality. And you can read, there's a ton, like books, people who write books love the ultimate, and so there's a lot of stuff on that.
Everybody wants to talk about emptiness.
Yeah, exactly. And you can kind of intuit it, but I infer from the way Michael and Bill and Dora and our teachers, Julia, have a really guarded approach to the ultimate, which is why I probably shouldn't have mentioned anything at all. Is because it's like the little
Chinese.
the Chinese handcuffs.
Finger cuffs.
Finger cuffs. The more you try to figure it out with the cognitive side, I think the further away you get from it. So.
Beyond concept, beyond language, beyond duality.
Beyond.
Any of our attempts to point at it are going to be insufficient.
We work with it directly when we do practices like Chenrezig, and that's probably the best way to talk about it. And probably I shouldn't have said anything.
And you did say that equanimity is the way to focus. If you focus your efforts in having an equanimous mind, because I guess that if you were going to discriminate, it's when you're discriminate when you're having a confrontation with an aversion or a craving, and when you're seeing it. It's like that seems to be like you can focus your entire life on just that, and be plenty fine with the other part.
Yeah, I think that's why to me it was so helpful to read that thing about I, because there's a way that you can't. You do get into the near enemy very quickly if you're faking equanimity. I feel like that person's really irritating me. I'm just gonna be cool about it. It's not exactly the practice.
Right.
The best you're going to do there probably is get to indifference. The practice is to see that you're having that experience, and to be, to the extent possible, be present with it, so that you can watch it arise and persist and fall away. And you know, if it's a relationship with another person, it might not fall away for years.
Yeah.
It could be a long time. But you can leaven it, rather than that just being a painful experience. You can leaven it with these. That's why I like what Alan Wallace did by putting bodhicitta there. You can see how the practices that we do, four immeasurables and bodhicitta, dedicating the merit, so many of the practices that we do, depend on our kind of ability to at least see the craving and aversion that we're having with these things. Otherwise, we kind of just stay stuck in neutral. You know, we're just constantly ping pong.
I mean, those are some of the most impactful meditations when you're distracted 1,000 times in an hour. You know, because then that means that you're noticing each time, and that you're noticing the moment-to-moment changing nature of it. And there's something in watching it do its thing that frees you from it each time. You know, without engaging with it and getting lost and letting your mind go. But then that's part of it too, because you say like, oh, there goes my mind, the mind thing. It went off on its journey. Now I'm back in the moment. And then, you know, 2 seconds later, like, oh, here's something, and maybe it's going to take me, maybe it's not. You know, meditation to me is always, you know, how quickly can I notice that before you know, it takes me. Yeah, it's nice to get you know, just like a taste of that game that, you know, it seems like a game, it seems playful, but at the same time it also feels like there's something serious about it. It's like the, you know, the freedom of our own experience to have, and yeah, bringing that into relationships, it's like it's hard to do unless you sit there with yourself for a while.
You have to.
Were you going to read the actual technique for how to do the meditation?
Oh, that's what this is here for. I don't know what page it was on.
Don't.
Here we are.
There you go.
Begin by imagining three people. This is from Michael. He prepared this for a retreat, a Tonglen retreat, probably in the 90s. 1996. Begin imagining three people in front of you, one for whom you feel a definite attraction, one for whom you feel a sense of revulsion or aversion, and one to whom you are indifferent. Face them in your imagination. Look for the source of these feelings within yourself. This investigation may culminate in the insight that these feelings originate from within oneself. Explore the possibility that circumstances could easily result in a radical change in your feeling toward each of them. We've all had the experience of a friend becoming an enemy. We may also have experienced an enemy who has become a friend. And our lives are filled with feelings of indifference turning to warmth of friendship. Then contemplate the extent to which you can perceive the interconnectedness you share with these three people. Isn't your perception limited to the relatively recent past? When your feelings of attachment, revulsion, and indifference dissolve into a more neutral sentiment, rest for a moment in that neutrality. For some reason, and you can try it this way, you can investigate it, I have not done this yet. Alan Wallace suggests starting with the person with whom you have an indifferent relationship, and then going to the positive and then the negative. Not really sure why that would be. But, you know, changing the order may have benefits that you don't perceive until you try.
And
When asked to think of someone with whom I have an indifferent relationship, that's always a challenge for me, because anybody that I can think of, I have some feeling about. Whether it's the checker at the grocery stand or the postman or whatever. So that for me, at any rate, I don't know how to imagine someone with whom I have an indifferent feeling. Because I have some feeling about anybody that I can imagine.
Yeah, I really relate to this. I know this is going to be another great Sunday morning question. It seems like part of the practice is recognizing how quickly the mind will attach, and especially in the one-on-one equanimity, how quickly the mind will attach feelings of positivity or negativity towards people. These practices really are about showing us how our own mind works, and working with our own mind and training it. I have, in my practice, tried to think of people that I just glimpsed on the street, like walking down the street or in a crowd or something, like just barely glimpsed, and work with that person. And I found that my mind will often conjure a positive or negative relationship with them, which is fascinating. So I don't know what to say beyond that. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Even somebody I've only seen, somehow I can decide whether they're good or bad.
we have opinions, we
Yeah.
have preferences.
Yeah,
I only saw them for a moment, but I really like the way they look.
that's right.
They're sort of a little bit over on the scale, on the side of people, and I feel one of that.
Well, he was sitting in an SUV, so obviously.
It almost seems like it's a semantics thing there, like, because it doesn't seem like there's, I can't imagine anybody don't have any feelings about it all, but it seems like, one way we can, I think, kind of politely refer to somebody that we might have antagonism towards is to say, well, I don't care about them, I don't care. I couldn't care less what happens to them. And in a way you could say, okay, that is indifference, but it's actually like they're kind of on the opposite end. Therefore, they're like kind of almost the revulsion end of the people that we like, and the people that we care about that we know. That's not the terrible person that we wish would stop causing pain in the world, and they're also not the person that we know well and are personally dearly connected to. I can imagine that person in the middle, the person in the crowd, I can kind of that fits in a slot because I don't know them. And then there's people like I think, oh my God, what would happen to me if anything happened to them? Like I really care about. And then there's the indifferent. I almost think of it. It's like yeah. I don't know that I would care that much if they got hit by a truck. That's kind of almost what I think. I think what they mean by indifference there, maybe, and then that makes more sense because then they do fall into those slots for me. Because I agree with you. There's nobody. If they're human, I don't have zero feelings for them. Automatically, it seems like there's feelings.
And the practice that Michael is describing it's really a practice. It's not a requirement, but you're able to put somebody in front of you to whom you have no reaction whatsoever. It's really about putting someone in front of you who, maybe you just don't have big opinions there. You don't have really strong feelings about them one way or another, and then engage in that contemplation. Really imagine, like, what would it take for me to suddenly care about them as much as I as much as you care about your son, or what would it take for somebody who's really been bothering you at work to suddenly, what would it look like if that was suddenly transformed and you became close friends? And we experience that movement in our ordinary life of people changing position in our lives. Like, you were nothing to me a month ago and now you feel really important, or we used to be really close and now we don't talk. Like, we have felt experience around what it means to see these things change, and when we look at them in the context of our Dharma, we can see how much of that is actually just being manufactured right in here. And the story, the narrative we have may be about they did this or they did that or they didn't do this. But when we really look at our own experience, we can discover how it is that we're manufacturing it. But we're so convinced that it rests out there with them. And for me, working with equanimity, seeing that has always been key to getting a little taste of what it would be like to just let all of that soften, to just let it settle a little bit.
Michael adds a really interesting instruction here that I've never worked with before. After you do the three things, he says, then contemplate the extent to which you perceive the interconnectedness you share with these three people. Which is interesting. I think we can, looking at that interconnectedness, looking at the shape of our connection to people, is going to show us, is going to reveal a little bit more about the nature of those feelings we're having. So this week I'm definitely going to try that last instruction that Michael gave and see what happens.
Would you read it again?
Yeah. Then contemplate the extent to which you can perceive the interconnectedness you share with these three people.
So I guess that gives you a more global framework within which to work on that relationship, or see how you could bring it to neutrality. Because you see so many factors coming about what shaped your opinions towards them, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't done the practice. We'll have to see.
And I think it's interesting that he uses the word perceive. To me, that's a little more tightly connected to on an experiential level, as opposed to kind of analyzing it on a conceptual level.
In my mind went to the idea of, like, how does the interconnectedness shape my feelings? What's cause and effect here? Which one is which? So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Interesting.
That's what contemplations are good for. We can see what happens when we try them.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly something interesting and juicy to go home with. And we've also talked a lot about obstacles this week, so if it feels fruitful to you, helpful to you, look this week in your practice for where you find obstacles and resistance, and think about how you can apply humor and recognition and what else did we talk about? A sense of merit.
Yeah. Think about toy with the idea of merit, if that seems like something you'd like to do.
Yeah.
Have we
been ending these sessions with dedicating to merit?
We have,
Okay, good, I'm good.
Yep.
Okay, I'm trying to remember. Good.
Yeah, so if we have any idea what merit is.
yes.
Right.
Let's try to have
More
confidence in the
confused
sense
about
that we're planting a valuable seed here.
And since we're trying to perceive our interconnectedness, our tradition tells us that by virtue of our interconnectedness in the moment of offering that which is good, that all beings actually do share in it and experience the benefit of it at some level. So let's also hold that idea.
By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You guys.